Welcome to History 2010. My name is Dr. Sawyer. I'll be your professor for today and hopefully for the rest of the semester. Down with new technology. It's just going to break us, all right? Let's throw our shoes in the mills and the factories and go back to an agrarian life. Just kidding. That's the philosophy of a lot of early Americans, though, dealing with the new technology that we spoke about. I've been talking about this lecture and mentioning it several times this semester. This is where I'm going to cover the history of U.S. slavery, tie it back into a lot of the themes that we've been talking about from early on in the class. But as you'll recall from the last lecture, where we talked about technology and the Industrial Revolution, the lecture Revolutions in Everyday Life, we talked a lot about how the Industrial Revolution shapes both the North and the South. We wrapped up yesterday by talking about how people's lives changed in the North, moving from agrarian society into factories. And so today, what we're going to talk about is the lives of millions of people in the South. And we are going to talk about the enslaved people and the institution that kept them in that life, how it evolved, and how it is going to end up becoming the dividing line that leads to the Civil War. To begin with, I think if you're going to understand American slavery, you have to understand where it evolves from. How does it come about? Why is it that the United States gets involved in this? There's a debate amongst historians, and it's a debate about whether or not slavery created racism in the U.S. or whether or not racism led to slavery, right? So where does this come from? I'll tell you, I'm not one of the country's leading experts on the history of slavery, but I have read a lot about it. I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, reading primary sources. Read the book that you were assigned, The Half Has Never Been Told, by Ed Baptist. I've read that book. It's groundbreaking work in the history of slavery in the U.S. Just a lot of input. I will tell you that I am fairly convinced that in that relationship, it is slavery that creates the racism. And I'll explain that as we go along. But to even be able to engage in this debate, you have to understand the origins of slavery and how it evolves in the U.S. So let's step back. Let's think about slavery in a way that's hard to do, and it's a good thing that it's hard to do. Let's think about it in the context of an economy, right? And the thing with this is we have to step back and ask, what role does it actually fulfill? By no means should anyone consider that starting this way is in any way dismissing the inhumanity and brutality of it. But you can't really understand the system unless you think about it like this. I'm convinced. So slavery is one of several possible solutions to the basic problem of agriculture. If you have more land than you can farm yourself or farm with the help of family members, you need people there to work. And agriculture is not like a factory. Because at a factory, you're constantly producing things, right? If you lose your workers for a week, you lose 2% of your annual output and you start back up when you get more workers. In agriculture, if you don't have people there to work when you need to plant, the whole crop could go bad. If you don't have people there when you need to harvest, you could lose things. But then, you don't really need people for several months in between planting. Certainly not as many people. So this is a problem. Because if you are trying to grow for the purpose of increasing your wealth, what are you going to do? How are you going to make sure that the people you need there during those critical moments are still there after several months of you not wanting to pay them? This is particularly a problem early on in the U.S. because in Jamestown, for example, people could get land. Remember, indentured servants came over, they worked a period of time, but then they could get land. You were on the cusp of a frontier. This isn't somewhere where land is finite early on. Nevertheless, the indentured servitude allows for people who get the large plots of land in Jamestown to have people there to help them when you need them. Because if you're indentured, that means you don't get to leave and go somewhere else. You are obligated to be there and work for a person. So it transcends, kind of our modern notion of hourly wages, right? You've made a commitment to someone over the long term. So this is it. I mean, early on in the colonies, you've got three options if you're going to have a large tract of land that's more than you can grow. One, as I just said, is indentured servitude. And that works for a while. The other one is to try to either employ or enslave the indigenous peoples there, force them to work for you. As it turns out, they don't really want to do that. And you're on their turf. They know the land better than you do. And as I said, with the early days of Charleston in the Carolina colony, for the first several years, what did they do? They enslaved Native American people, but not for plantations there. They sold them into the Caribbean, because that's one of the keys that makes slavery so effective, is when you, particularly in the United States, same basic principle. When you take someone away from the place they know, completely disorient them, to a place where, the first generation of folks that show up in slavery, they don't speak the language. They don't know anything. You keep them disoriented. So you can't employ the indigenous workforce. So the third one, that's what U.S. growers turn to. They turn to African slavery. They do this because, as I said, indentured servitude works for a while. But you recall Bacon's Rebellion, right? This huge revolution that threatened the entire power structure of the colony. And who backed the rebels? It was indentured servants who had become free and had no land to go to. So they realized that continuing to bring people over who are going to work for several years, they want land, but you're trying to stop colonists from going past the Appalachian Mountains. You're essentially setting up conflict. You need a reliable workforce. You were on a frontier where if people don't follow the rules, they can still get further and find land. And the last one is this. Trying to keep a group of people in a place. Trying to, as time goes on, this will matter, trying to justify the clearly inhumane institution. Race, just simply the difference in skin color, that actually becomes an asset to the enslavers. Because if you are a European indentured servant who runs away, how will I ever be able to catch you? That's hard. But if you create an entire institution around people who are physically marked simply by a different pigment in their skin, nevertheless, it makes people heightened aware. It makes a heightened awareness to people. If you see someone with dark skin you've never seen before, well, that's a pretty good chance that they've run away from somewhere else. It makes it much easier to maintain the dominance of that structure and keep those people from being able to get away. Now, the U.S., as I said before, remember, Carolina colony is the first to really embrace the plantation system. It then spreads. By the late 17th century, Virginia comes to embrace it, particularly after the problems of the indentured servant system. But these enslaved people come through what's called the transatlantic slave trade. They are brought from Western Africa, primarily. And in these years, and it's really hard to get numbers. One, because data just wasn't what it is now back then. But also because you're talking about human beings, and we're like, well, they're people, aren't there? Aren't there records of them? Yeah, I mean, to the people that are buying and selling them, they're cargo. They're not people. So the estimates vary, but approximately somewhere around 12 million Africans are brought across from Western Africa to the Western Hemisphere, to the New World. Of those, about 600,000, that's about 5%, are brought to what becomes the United States. The overall slave trade is going to end in the mid-19th century. The U.S. gets out of it in 1808. But there are a couple of reasons why the U.S. sees such a small percentage. One of them is that in the U.S., particularly early on, the types of crops that grow in the U.S., and tobacco being a big one, it's not as brutal as the sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean, you look at human beings the same way that a mason looks at bricks, the same way that an artist looks at paint. Well, you got to keep on buying it because you're using it up. People are putting that. They a lot of them don't live. So you're replacing people who die at a much higher rate than in the U.S. Some people learn about that and they say, well, I guess it wasn't so bad for enslaved people in the U.S. then. I'm not sure why that's a takeaway you're looking for. But early on, there's a difference. So 600,000 people taken from their homes, kidnapped, and brought here. The trip between Africa and the New World is what we call the Middle Passage. It's part of what people refer to as the Atlantic Triangle. There's a flow of goods from the U.S., primarily raw goods, go to Europe. Then the ships go from Europe to Africa. They then purchase enslaved people. They come to the U.S. with cargo loads full of human beings. They sell them off. Then they buy goods from the raw materials from the U.S. to sell in England. This Middle Passage, depending on the time, depending on the weather, depending on a lot of factors, could take between 1 and 6 months. People, a lot of people, don't even make it. An estimated 12% of the entire population that is stolen away from Africa. And by the way, the word stolen is the way that they refer to themselves. A lot of them. They were stolen from Africa, stolen from their homes. About 12% don't make it. And I want you to understand the horror of this. You are taken and forced onto a ship. You don't know where you're going. You don't know what awaits you on the other end of it. But you've seen the way this new life is looking. What we have here is a diagram of a slave ship. It evolves over time. But like all cargo, and remember, this is the way that these slave traders consider them. Profitability is what matters. Early on, you might have less cramped ships, but eventually people figure out, well, we're looking for profitability, and if we pack as many people as we can on these ships, sure, a lot of them are going to die, but overall, we'll get more people there, and the loss that we have in dead human beings will more than make up, be made up for by the amount that we make when we auction these human beings off. They are put under the deck of the ship. They are often tied together and bound together by chains. There's no getting up. No bathroom break. Disease is rampant. If one person comes on the ship with the disease, it's going to spread. You're in tight quarters. Your nourishment, the food and water you get, is an expense to the people running the ship. They're going to give you as little as they can based on a calculation. Sure, some people will die, but we're looking at these human beings as part of a profit formula if we're slave ship traders. There are accounts of women being taken on these ships who are pregnant, giving birth, and their babies just dying. People are chained together for this entire trip. If someone dies, you're chained to them. They're aware that it's healthier if they bring the folks up on the deck to give them fresh air and light. But there are accounts of people hurling themselves, these African people hurling themselves off the decks of ships just to go ahead and end it in their lives. Of course, that's bad for profit. So this is your introduction to the New World if you are one of these millions of Africans who are stolen away. We so often, as Americans, think about the impact that these institutions have on us, and it's reasonable. We still live in a world shaped in many ways by the institution of slavery. But I think it's remarkable that people don't think about the impact on the world. How often do you hear people, because I know that I hear it, laughingly writing off Western African countries, looking at them and saying, why can't they get their act together? What's wrong with them? Man, they're always involved in some types of wars. Oh, well, I wonder what you think the world might look like if the healthiest amongst us as Americans were dragged off against our will to the other side of the world to build the economy for a whole nother country. And then people who did that to us looked at the country we were from and mocked it for not being able to get things together. These things still have effect. In your mind, 150 years ago, 200 years ago is a long time. But it's not. The story begins of Africans in what's going to be the United States. It begins in 1619. In this year, a pirate raid on a Portuguese ship by English pirates. You guys may recall that I told you that one of the main reasons for the establishment of the Roanoke colony was to be a port and a base for English pirate raids on Spanish and Portuguese ships. Jamestown has the same position. And so what happens? 1619, a ship is taken by English privateers. They then come into Jamestown to get supplies, to get back across the ocean. On that ship, there are about 20 Africans. Again, this is early on in the slave trade. And to get the supplies they want and need to go back to England, they make exchanges for these black folks. Thus brings the first Africans into the story of the United States. It's very early on. It's interesting, though. Anthropologists who have studied this area, if any of you know Dr. Sykes, who is here at MTSU, she does historical anthropology. She's worked in Virginia and in the early settlement sites. She's quite brilliant. You know, anthropologists use not just documents like historians do, but they do digs. They use they unearth things. They look at habitation sites, and it's really interesting because in these early sites where in Jamestown, the evidence that's left behind doesn't appear that at first that these folks were treated as enslaved people. There's some idea that perhaps the people who negotiated for them to come onto their farms may have considered that they didn't purchase the human, they purchased an indentured contract. So years of that person's servitude. It's really complex early on. You can look into that. I can give you guys some readings if you want more on it. It's hard to really go into it. It involves looking at digs and where people live. It's a whole complex way of seeing the past through physical space that anthropologists use. So at first, and you may think that seems kind of against what you might have expected, but understand that there's no tradition of slavery here. Right? Slavery requires laws. Slavery requires code. It requires precedent. It requires a system set up to defend that institution. And early on, that doesn't seem to have existed in the first years of Jamestown. But it gets there. Because what ends up happening is that around the same time that the Carolina colony is bringing in plantation slavery, Virginia is beginning to realize that the problems of indentured servitude are too much. So they ban indentured servitude. And at roughly the same time, they pass a series of laws codifying slavery. These began in the 1660s, and these uphold several things, like that the children of enslaved people belong to the owner, that you cannot baptize a person, because see, this was the thing. Some folks had said, but if you're a Christian, then how could a Christian enslave another Christian? And they actually had to codify that. They had to say being baptized doesn't stop you from being enslaved. And if you read the slave code, it says clearly, we want to clear, and this is from the House of Burgesses, we want to clarify this. Baptizing does not mean that a person is freed. And we're passing this so that the owners of enslaved people here can feel good about still proselytizing Christianity to them. Because there was some idea that if baptizing them would have led to their freedom, that the slave owners would have ceased trying to, essentially allowing them to practice Christianity or trying to encourage it amongst them. These evolve, and eventually you get to a point where by 1705, 1706, you have laws on the books that lock this in place. It's not like South Carolina. South Carolina, again, the plantation is in the DNA of that state. In Virginia, it changes. But it changes, as I said, as an effect of the demands for goods, of economic principles. We need to make sure, and you can see it emerging, that this is our property. It needs to be secured. That these people, these human beings that we are confident enough have souls, that we need to clarify the issue of Christianity here, that they are property. In 1808, the U.S. bans the transatlantic slave trade. That was the earliest it could possibly be done. There are two things in the Constitution that it says can never be changed by amendment. One of them is that all states shall have equal representation in the Senate. The other one is that the transatlantic slave trade cannot be banned prior to the year 1808, and they do it pretty much as soon as it can be done. Nevertheless, the population of enslaved people in the U.S. grows, primarily through people having children, but also because there are blockade runners and pirates that continue to bring in enslaved people from Africa up until the point slavery is abolished. By the time you get to the 1850s and early 1860s, these folks are considered heroes. The people in the South who are fighting for slavery. And here's a map you can see here of, this is where enslaved people lived, and this is 1810. So this is just as the cotton world is beginning to come upon us. Notice a couple of things. This is the old plantation world. You see this? This is before you even have the statehood for Mississippi or Alabama. And you can see along the coastline here are where the old plantations are. But you can see that it's starting to make its way up the Mississippi a bit here. And one thing to notice here. Do you see this right here? There is a clear strip right in the middle of all this. You look at Kentucky up here, you see slavery being fairly common. Into Middle Tennessee, you see it being fairly common. But you have an entire strip running right through here where there are very few enslaved people. Why is that? Does anyone know? Yes, Aaron wrote in the chat. Mountains. Yeah. You cannot effectively run a plantation in the Appalachian Mountains. In very few cases you can. We will return to this point when we get to the Civil War, because for all the people who like to make the argument that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, one of the things I think that if they're willing to listen to evidence, things I think might convince them is to see what happens in the Appalachian regions during the Civil War, where the bulk of the population is ardently against the war. And in fact, they, from time to time, rebel against Confederate leaders from their states who try to bring them in and force them to fight. I'm getting older. I'm 42. And so the world that I grew up in and the world that my students, that those of you right here grew up in, is different. But I still hear things, still hear arguments. I still see people feeling the need to mitigate the damage of slavery or mitigate the horror of slavery. I don't understand it. But I'll tell you, over the last 130, 140 years, the story has become pretty polished for people who don't want to acknowledge the horror of it or people who try to shirk it off. There are a couple of points that people like to make, and I never understand why people cannot simply look at this as a horrible part of our story and find beauty in the fact that we have moved on, and in that beauty find inspiration to move further towards the ideals that we've professed in our founding documents and since. But I hear people continuing to feel a need to mitigate the horror of slavery. And I'll tell you some of the things that I hear them say. And you guys who are in the room, just put your hand up if you've heard these before. One of the things that I hear people say is that the U.S. shouldn't take the blame for slavery because it was Africans who enslaved other Africans, and Africans enslaved each other. And so therefore, in the United States, why should the United States bear the brunt for it? It was actually, Africans did that to each other. Have you guys heard that before? Have you heard someone say this before? Yeah. All right. A person who makes that argument is unlikely to actually be educated on this topic, because the similarities between the two institutions, as they were common in Africa and common in the United States, were fundamentally different. In most parts of Western Africa, where enslaved people came from, slavery was an obligation of one's time and labor. If you took a person, they owed you something. But the relationship of enslaved to enslaver was a bit more fluid. For example, it didn't mean that you were owned by the person. It meant that you had to work for them. As such, if you did fulfill your obligations, you could also carry out other endeavors. It was possible to purchase your freedom. I've read accounts of enslaved people actually owning other enslaved people. It's a far more fluid system that has to do with owning an amount of one's work and not owning the human being. In most West African societies, the children born to enslaved people were not enslaved. They were born free. By the 18th century in the U.S., by the 17th century in the U.S., actually, the 1660s this gets put in place in Virginia. By this point, the United States has established a slave system that has determined that the children of enslaved people are themselves enslaved. This is a big difference. I'll just tell you this. I got a kid. And you've probably been around children. One of the beautiful things about children is that you look at them and you say, you could be anything. I watch my son every day becoming someone different. And I wonder what he'll be. If you were an enslaved person who had a child under the slave system in the United States, you didn't get that. You knew what they'd be. They'd be somebody else's property, and they will be. They'll be beaten. They might be raped. You might not even get to see them if they're sold off to someone else. Taking one of these amazing beauties of life and infusing it with this horror think is a big difference. Western African societies, you also don't have race as a concept. There's notions of difference amongst groups, but you don't have as stark of a visual difference. And this is huge because it is in this stupid visual difference between people, the way that light reflects off of skin because of pigment that we know does not matter. It is in that you can build a story of difference that makes a group of people out to be something fundamentally different than you. Race as a marker not only makes it easier to keep people in place, to keep them and run them down if they run off. Also, as time goes on, as pressures come against slave owners, as more people come to believe in the promise of the U.S. as something bigger than simply benefiting a handful of people, the problem becomes that slavery, as we've pointed out, even the founders, many of them knew this, it becomes more and more evident, the absolute gap between the promise of all men are created equal and the reality of slavery. And as cotton takes over and the brutality of this system becomes more and more intense, slave owners are up against a lot to justify what they're doing. The race gives them something to hinge their story on. Well, yeah, they're not as good as us. And this becomes the story. And this is what blows my mind. This was made, these stories about race, about the difference, about the second-class nature of black folks. This story was created by wealthy people 200 years ago to justify why they got to dominate almost everything. And some people still believe it. Oh yeah, well, look, look at them. If it was, they can't take care of themselves. They're lazy. If we didn't make them work, they wouldn't work. I mean, look at what's going on over there. Are they civilized in the places they're from? No. We brought them over here. If left to their own devices, they couldn't handle it. They're like children. We're here to take care of them. We give them Christianity. We make sure that they work and that they have fulfilling lives. And if it weren't for us, then these people would be lost in a jungle somewhere with no opportunity to live in civilization. And yet we've brought them here to be part of our family. We've brought them here. They live on our land. We take care of them. We feed them. And this is the only way they could possibly be part of this civilization. So isn't it better that we've brought them here and made them part of our family? That's the story. And it hinges upon black folks being fundamentally unable to make their own decisions. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You keep them from being able to read and write, you can say, look at them, they can't read and write. You beat them into working every day. Well, there's no opportunity to find out whether or not they work every day. You simply say, if we didn't do this, they wouldn't work. This is a story created by a small group of very powerful people. If there's one thing history teaches us, it's be careful when someone sells you a story, if on the other end of that story is a huge payday for them. And cotton does change everything here. It changes the way the plantation works. It also changes the amount of power that these folks have. As we talked about last time, the invention of the cotton gin and innovations in textile technology create a huge boom in the demand for cotton across the world. And to fulfill this demand, slavery moves west. And just like in South Carolina, where slavery is in its DNA, it is in the DNA of Alabama, it is in the DNA of Mississippi. You can actually look when we get to the Civil War, you'll see there were two phases of secession. The first wave began in December with South Carolina, December of 1860. And the first, by February of 1861, you've already got the Confederacy established. Look at those states. South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. They're the ones. The other slave states follow. Some slave states don't leave the Union. But you can see the ones pretty clearly. The ones that are not even going to take a risk on their source of wealth being touched. Because those states are dominated by slave plantation owners. If you have not already read the excerpt from Ed Baptist's book, The Half Has Never Been Told, know that it's going to hurt. Baptist's argument in this book, and it has been criticized, you can read the criticisms of it. I've never found any of the criticisms to be particularly convincing because they, in my opinion, they criticize his argument, but then actually direct their critique at other aspects. It's a long story that historians get into. I just always want to make sure that you're aware that this isn't, that there are challenges to this. But Baptist's argument is, you guys have learned in a very general capacity about what the Industrial Revolution does. The steam engine, right? The spinning jenny, the cotton gin, how it transforms productivity by people, and it's all based on machines. The innovation in cotton production, there are innovations. Don't get me wrong, certain tools and things like that. But it doesn't have its cotton gin. It doesn't have its spinning jenny. It doesn't have its steam engine. And Baptist argues, very convincingly in my opinion, that the innovation of the cotton plantation is psychological torture, physical torture. Walking the line between beating a person and terrifying a person enough to make them stretch their physical capabilities for fear, but just stopping before the point where you completely disable an entire group of people. Now, you might disable a couple of them. You might even kill a couple of them to keep the fear going. But you can't run the system on something that will totally break people. So you mostly break people. You break people just to the point where they don't totally snap. But the story of zombies, the story of the Walking Dead, a lot of these come out of the story of enslaved people who their entire existence is run by the hand of the slave driver. They are just bodies acting out the desire of the person who has forced them into submission. This is a whole new world. Here you have the U.S., a map of the U.S. in 1840, and I just want you to see this here. By this point, this southern portion here, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, we talked about the Missouri Compromise that brought Missouri in as a slave state. But you can see by the time you get to 1840, Arkansas, all the areas south here, these states have been incorporated. Every new state is 2 more senators for the slave states. There's more representatives, and of course, the enslaved people, the millions of enslaved people in the South, are counting for representation in Congress for the southern states, right? The 3/5 compromise. It's 60%, but the more enslaved people in those states, the more seats they have in Congress. It's ironic. Here you have it, and there's some great maps here, and I'll just show you a couple of these. This is a progression. And by the way, these come from a guy named Lincoln Mullen, who does really great mapping projects to visualize the institution of slavery and of populations. You can see it move here, and by the way, on the website, it's a bit clearer than this. But this comes from census data. Statistics are not readily available in the same way back then they are today. But I can tell you that the census does provide what we need, and that's a part of the Constitution. So we have that. You can see this. Look, as the states become states in the South, look how quickly the enslaved population grows there. Here's another visualization. I think this one might even be more stark. The next one I'm going to show you is the population density. Basically, let's see, here we go. This is the percentage of the population living in any region that is enslaved. Look, follow the Mississippi River here. Look what happens here. In the darkest areas, we're talking over 70% of the population in those areas are enslaved. Consider this, that when you have that large of the portion of the population enslaved, what you have are very few people in that area benefiting from the wealth created by that institution. These are going to be some of the most powerful people in the U.S. Life for enslaved people is essentially the life that of any property. Violence can be imposed on folks arbitrarily. You don't need a reason. There's no court case. In fact, one of the things the Virginia codes does that come out of the late 17th century is they clarify that it is okay to beat your slaves and even murder your slaves, because actually the House of Burgesses clarifies. They say you cannot actually murder an enslaved person because murder requires premeditation. And what property owner would premeditatively decide to destroy their own property? That's the argument. Lack of family stability. One of the things that you see in those maps is you see that the population of enslaved people, the percentage, remains constant on the East Coast. And the number remains constant on the East Coast as it grows in the South. What's happening is that the old slave plantations of North Carolina, Virginia, they are selling the children of enslaved people on their plantations off and to be auctioned in New Orleans. And they are keeping just enough people there to kind of do what they want them to do. And the children, selling the children off, is the way that they can maintain revenue on their plantations without the types of profitability they had previously. And after the transatlantic slave trade cuts off, and then the cotton industry booms, enslaved people, very expensive. There's a whole financial setup around it we'll talk about in a second. Rape is just a part of life. Your marriage does not matter. How can you be married? Who you love does not matter. Your property. I've already told you the story of Sally Hemings, the woman that Thomas Jefferson had children with, and that Sally Hemings was almost certainly the daughter of his father-in-law. But in these situations, you are completely the property and you're completely at the other end of another person's will, legally. So rape is common. You can read accounts of people who from the outside of the South who visit plantations, and it is a common remark in their journals or in the things they write to remark about how many of the young enslaved children look a lot like the owners of the plantation or the folks who drive the enslaved people, these folks who implement the torture on the ground level. And even emancipated black folks in the North who are free, they face the threat of re-enslavement because it's profitable. And who's going to believe you? That's the beautiful thing about racism, isn't it? If I want to absolutely crush you and dominate you, I make your entire character suspect. Oh yeah, he's free, sure. What do you got to prove it? Papers? I can get rid of those. No one's listening. You might be familiar with the story of Solomon Northup, 12 years a slave. His narrative is unique in that he was actually a musician who lived in the North. He was tricked into going to Washington, D.C. to play music. While there, because D.C. is on the border of two slave states, he was kidnapped and spent 12 years working on the cotton plantations in the Deep South. But he was literate and he wrote his story. The film came out not too long ago, and he tells his own story of life in that cotton plantation system. He was free and simply kidnapped. And once you got into those parts of the world down there, nobody believed in you. Even if they did, they wouldn't care. Now, this is the this is the hard thing to wrestle with here, I think, for a lot of folks. There's a story about slavery in the United States that it's kind of like a bedtime story. You know, bedtime stories are meant to make you feel better about things, you know, make you feel like the world's okay. Because if you don't have those, sometimes you guys have probably laid in bed at night thinking about something and stressing about something. And without something to put you at ease, you'll lay there trying to sleep, but you can't get your mind off of it. One of the things that people struggle with and they need these bedtime stories for has to do with the culpability. I mean, some people simply want to mitigate the damage, right? I see that a lot in the South in particular. People who want to be like, yeah, it wasn't that bad, or the whole plantation there, all the enslaved people here had it pretty good, or they were taken care of. That story, that's the way a lot of people in the South deal with it, which blows my mind. You weren't there. You think it's possible that people were not inhumane in the past? Do you need to tell a story in which it's not what it is? How much do you have to be convinced of the fact that something that you as a human being on a very basic level know is horrible? How much of a story do you need to hear over and over and over again to be convinced that it wasn't so bad? There's a whole industry of this. We'll talk about it if you're in my History 2020 class, because as the South maintains, basically takes power back, the same people that ran it before slavery was over, they make a whole story up and they push it on people. We're still telling it for some reason. But in the North, it's a different narrative. I discovered this when I went up to Michigan. I taught at Michigan State. It's where I got my PhD. And I'm a Southerner through and through. I lived in the South my whole life till I was 27. I went up there and I started teaching, talking to my students, and I realized that they've learned a pretty interesting narrative too. Another nice bedtime story. Their bedtime story is, we stopped it. It was a horrible thing, and we didn't have anything to do with it. The North didn't have anything to do with it. And you talk to people from the North all over the place. They pit the problem with slavery on the South. Again, that's a story of a person who's not educated. Because it wasn't just plantation owners who benefited. And let me make clear, they benefited by far the most. They controlled not only the wealth, they controlled the politics of the region. But there's plenty of other people who benefit. Northern financiers. Enslaved people are a huge investment. Get a loan. Why do people give loans? To make interest. Northern banks fund the slave trade. They fund the expeditions to take enslaved people from the East down into New Orleans to be sold. Right here, the image that I've got here, if you notice, has anyone here ever had Aetna insurance before? Aetna is a fairly large insurance company today, one of the largest ones in the industry, still exists. Here I have a copy of a slave insurance policy issued by Aetna. You see here it is, issued in 1853. Aetna Insurance Company of, I'm sorry, does that say Charleston on there? Can you see it? Because it says Aetna Insurance Company of Hartford, Connecticut. Why do insurance company issue policy? Out of the goodness of their heart or because it's profitable? Factory owners in the North, they're not turning down that cheap cotton. Factory owners in England, not turning down that cheap cotton. Baptist argues in the book that I gave you the sample from, and others have argued this as well, that cotton is the first truly global commodity in the sense of a global market. That if you look back at global capitalism, the cotton trade is what the framework on which the global market is created. As such, we live in a world created by slavery. I also see a whole lot of the white folks that I grew up with. A whole lot of white folks who grew up without a whole lot. A lot of folks who wouldn't have a whole lot of opportunity in the world if it weren't for, a lot of the institutions that have been created in the 20th century. I consider myself in that lot. If it were not for a state university and the taxpayers in my state working a little bit and putting a little bit of money into into a system that allowed me to engage in moving up and having a good life, I wouldn't be here. It's one of the reasons I'm remain grateful. Take my job very seriously, because at MTSU I too work for. A portion of my pay comes from taxpayers, and it comes from you guys. I feel like you don't take things from people if you're not going to give back what you said you would. But I see a lot of people who have this kind of fantasy of what the Confederacy was. A lot of people defending it as if they would be defending it in the world they live in now. I even have a friend of mine who said that he took a class at another Tennessee university on the first day of the U.S. history class. The professor said that if the Civil War had not been fought and slavery had not been ended in 1865, that everybody's life would still be just the same as if it hadn't been fought. Which should be a red flag to get the hell out of that class, because any historian worth their salt knows that you can't tell a what if as a certainty. But I also think that it's highly unlikely for several reasons. I want you to think about a story that tells the story of hierarchy. You got to remember that this story that's being told about racism and the people that weave this story, they're not just trying to keep white people on top. They're trying to keep themselves on top. And a lot of these folks are true believers. But they also own most anything worth having. The best land belongs to these folks. You're near a river, of course. It's going to belong to somebody. You think that you as a small farmer could actually hold your own against a guy who owns hundreds of acres, thousands of acres, and an army of enslaved people? No. So poor white farmers, this institution of slavery is terrible for them too. Do you think that a society in which people believe that they are at the top and they're already there, do you think they're trying to pull people up to challenge their position of authority? Do you think you're going to have an MTSU? You think you're going to have public education systems in a place like that? Nah. Look, this is the order. I'm here because I deserve to be here. You're where you are because you deserve to be there. And you ain't going to compete with me against this good land. I might have a competition with another plantation owner. But the story that holds that black folks are worse than white folks also has a clause where the people who are white that aren't working hard, those folks that aren't doing well, they're not working hard. It's their own fault. This will culminate in the late 19th century with the idea of the gospel of wealth. But it's very much there too. Friends, the leaders of the Confederacy were not the friends of poor white folks either. Although poor white folks, in the scheme of things, got off a lot better. Ask yourself this, just to think about what a future Confederacy would hold on to. What it would create. The Confederate cause was maintaining a monoculture economy, primarily producing one crop to export en masse to industrialized countries. And it was creating that economy in a way that consolidated the wealth in the hands of a very tiny group of people. You don't have to believe me on this. Check me on this, but I'll say this. The countries of the world where the economies were dedicated to exporting to industrialized country, in which power was consolidated in the hands of a very small group of people, have not historically been good places to live in the 21st century. There are countries in South America that took that route. You don't want that future for yourself. People say slavery would have gone away on its own. That's a sweet story. But all of you right now in the year 2020, you see the hold that the story of racism still has on people 150 years plus after slavery was ended. Do you think that story would have gone away on its own in the presence of continued slavery? Because the Confederacy was a new nation and needed a new story. And the Confederate Constitution included the right to own human beings. In other ways, it was basically the same Constitution, 6-year presidency, but the right to own human beings was absolutely embedded in it. Its founding document. What do you think the story it would be telling today would look like? Think it would look just like the world we live in now? We can't know, but I think it's highly unlikely. I'll go back and say one more thing here. This picture is photograph. It's a famous photograph in the days of early photography of a man who was beaten so badly while he was enslaved that his entire back is a scar. You've probably seen it before. Have you seen it before? It's used. 2014, I taught a summer class in China. It was an entire U.S. history in like 2 weeks. It was intense. The students were fantastic. Nanjing University of Aeronautics and Astronautics. And I was teaching this class, and I had a realization. I had this slide because I wanted them to understand the history of slavery as well. I'm a Southerner, right? I mean, they have expectations about me. And I wanted to make it clear that they knew the history, also that whatever they thought about the South, I am not their stereotype, if I was. But when I showed this picture on the slide, here I am, an American who has seen this slide a lot of times, and I know it's a horrible, brutal picture, but I looked at a group of people when I hit this slide, and the entire room gasped. Testament to how, if we see something enough times, we can become desensitized to it. But this is a man whose life is marked on his back. We also like to tell a really sweet story about how abolitionism began. We like to think that it was always people, and this goes into this northern narrative, that people were against it and they fought against it, and you just don't really understand how abolitionism worked, or even what the word abolitionism means. Most people take anyone who was against slavery and say they were abolitionists, but they were not. And they weren't all on that side for the same reasons. In the first generation of Americans, you do have individuals and organizations that are dedicated to abolishing slavery. When I say abolitionism, I mean abolishing slavery altogether. That was not the dominant approach to it. So you have the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society. Formed in 1775, Benjamin Franklin was a member. The idea was trying to get rid of it. Of course, they have these Quaker roots, and that influence in the region, which lives on at this time. But by and large, the approach to ending slavery was not the one you might think it was, where people said, wow, what's happening to those people? That's horrible. There were people who felt that way, not the dominant. Hamilton himself was against slavery on kind of these unique grounds of the inhumanity of it for his time. Hamilton was ardently against slavery, and it came from his own experience. I told you that he worked in an import-export house when he was young in the Caribbean, and that's the hub of world trade. It's where he witnessed the way that it worked and learned so much. But in his time as a clerk, one of the things he would have to do would be when a ship came into port, they would give the bill of, they'd give the list of what was on there. Hamilton would have to go on and do inventory to make sure everything was there and to mark if anything had been broken or damaged otherwise along the trip. And as a part of that role, he would have to go onto ships that had enslaved people on them, and he would see them dead on the ship. And he would have to respond by essentially marking a sheet saying that a product had been broken on trip. So he had that experience. It was formative for him. It's one of the reasons that the rest of his life he was opposed to slavery. He saw that first step, the transatlantic slave trade, first person. But for a lot of people, it's not. It's not this idea of like it being inhumane. For a lot of folks early on, it's about the fact that slavery is actually really bad for white people. This is the angle. I told you before, I will make this argument several times. I told you that if you want to understand early America, it is completely fair and accurate to describe it as a white supremacist society. And I clarify to you that people throw about as a white supremacist. They use that as an inflammatory tactic. It's sometimes an insult, but it actually has a meaning. The meaning of this is a society that is based on the idea that white folks are above other people, that they are superior to other people. It's simply what it says. People who were not on board with slavery, and certainly with slavery's expansion, felt like the location and the living black folks living in their society was not right. That's not what it was for. And so for a lot of people, they said, well, we just need to not just get rid of slavery, we need to get rid of the black folks too. Northern states, they don't all just suddenly abolish slavery. You have gradual emancipation in these states. There's a proposition to actually compensate people for the property they've lost when they're emancipated. I told you, like in New Jersey and New York, you have slavery abolished for children. You've had the end of hereditary slavery, but you don't have the end of slavery all at once. The people who were already enslaved live out their lives as enslaved. Imagine the opportunities for you if you're born to human beings who are enslaved. You're free now, which is a huge, amazing step. I can't imagine what the parents must have felt looking at their children being born and knowing that their children will be free. But being free is not a carte blanche to do what you want to. You have to have resources. As a part of this, the freed American folks who are black, Americans begin to say, well, what are we going to do with them? In their minds, it was not simply like they're freed, they'll live here now. The question was, well, where are they going to go? And you see in 1817, as these children are being born and being freed, you have an organization established by very prominent Americans. It's called the American Colonization Society in 1817. And the entire purpose of this is to figure out where we're going to send all of the black folks once they're free. Because staying here is not acceptable in their minds. It's a really fascinating story. Because these folks, very prominent, very wealthy people, pull their money together and they actually establish several colonies in Western Africa. And you can see right here. And the main one is called Liberia. Liberia is a modern country. It's still around. It is colonized by this organization. They go to free black folks and say, we want to send you back to Africa. Now, what's the problem with that statement?
They're born here, so where are they going to go once they get to Africa?
Exactly. Back to Africa. It's like saying you're going to send me back to England or where. I don't know where the hell I'm from. Chop me up. I'm a mutt. We all Americans are mutts. I don't know why people are so proud of their bloodline when one of our great accomplishments has been to blur them to the point where we can't figure out how to hate somebody on the basis of it. We'll keep going by that. Or you could just actually learn to love people first and then move from there. But yeah, where the hell are you going to send me back to? Where are you going to send? You going to send somebody born in America back to? I ain't never been to Africa. But they're like, well, that's where they belong. It's bizarre. It's a bizarre concept. They established this area and they found what is the modern state of Liberia. For years when I taught this, I said, I need to read a good book on Liberia. And then I finally did. It's called Mississippi in Africa. It's about one of these colonies because eventually there's the main Liberia, but other organizations start up similar colonies along the coast there. You have Mississippi in Africa. You have Maryland in Africa. But the similar goal, take these people and get them out of here. And I think it's really interesting because their idea is we're going to send these people back to Africa where they belong. I'm I don't know, man. I think they might have been pretty American. Let me just tell you what happens in these areas. So when these colonies are set up, the people who come there from the United States set up a hierarchy in which they have the influence. They take the best land for themselves. They push the Native American people, the Native African people off the lands, and they forbid them to vote or have any say-so over the direction of the colony. That sound more African or more American to you? Sounds a lot like the history of the American colonies, doesn't it? It's amazing. This country just like 2 years ago had its first peaceful transition of power in decades. There's civil wars there throughout the 20th century. It's heartbreaking. But these folks are part of our story. They're another colony left. Up until the 20th century, and there are photographs of these, all throughout Liberia, there were these homes in Western Africa that looked just like the southern plantations in Mississippi and Alabama. Looked just like them. Why would there be houses there that look just like the ones built in Mississippi and Alabama? It's because the people who were enslaved were the ones who built the plantation houses in Mississippi and Alabama. And when they went to this colony, they built the homes for themselves. Go to a plantation house. Ask them, who built the house? It's one of my favorite things to do. Who built this house? Go to the plantation. Who built this house? Well, Andrew Jackson built this house. Damn, he must have been strong. He built this whole house? Nah. It was the people whose names are rarely mentioned on the tours. It hurts. If it hurts, it should. Lying to yourself about it, not going to change it. We've been doing that for a century and a half. Hasn't worked. As I've said before, if you really love something, if you really love someone, if you really love a concept in a place, you have to know them. Even when it hurts. It's our story, guys. We didn't do it. We can only decide whether or not we're going to contribute to it by continuing to turn our eyes to it because it's painful. That's the lecture for today. See you next time.